Good afternoon. We're going to start this session. My name is Bill Hellman from Smith Barney, and it is my pleasure to introduce to you the top military man in the United States, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Admiral Crowell has been chairman for 2 years. He's just been reconfirmed for another 2-year term in office. Admiral Crowell has been a Navy man for more than 41 years, graduating from Annapolis in 1947. He spent his early days in the Navy in the submarine area. He was named a full admiral in 1980. Prior to that, as a rear admiral, he commanded the Middle East forces in the Persian Gulf in 1976. He was commander-in-chief of the NATO forces in southern Europe in 1983. And just prior to becoming chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he was commander-in-chief of the U.S. Pacific Command. Having been an old Navy man myself, not nearly as long, of course, but I really have been impressed with the people I met at that time, because these people have an education. And I asked Admiral Crowell about his. He has a master's degree of education from Stanford. He has a PhD in politics from Princeton. So they get well educated along the way. I'm delighted to introduce Admiral William J. Crowell.
Shall I speak from there? Well, thank you very much, Bill. It's a pleasure for me to be here this afternoon. On a normal day, I would probably be talking about what's stealing the headlines. But I'm afraid today it's not my business, it's your business that's sort of monopolizing things. You've got the wrong speaker up here, and I'm the guy that should be asking the questions. And I assume, in all sincerity, that before I leave, somebody is going to explain to me why the stock market is going down so dramatically, and also when it will reverse. And please tell me before you tell anybody else. Right? I know you have a Wall Street firm who says that when they speak, everybody listens. I wish that was true in my case. It isn't necessarily. I talk a lot of places around this country. I usually show up to talk, and the audience shows up to listen. Unfortunately, we don't always finish at the same time together. But I hope that today we will. You know, speakers I've had a lot of disastrous experiences where it was thick going in my speaking career. Not too long ago, I had no more started than a man stood up on the front row, or rather in the back row, and said, "Admiral, you'll have to speak louder. I can't hear you." And a man stood up on the front row and said, "Let's change places. I can hear him." That's always encouraging. I must tell you, though, this is a tough town. I've been away from it for a few years before I returned 24 months ago, and I've learned it can be a harsh place. I'm confident that if Moses went up to Capitol Hill instead of Mount Sinai, the 2 tablets he would have brought back would have been aspirin, and I do quite a bit of that. It's not always pleasant, but it seems to be one of the occupational hazards. It's gratifying for me to be here, though, and sort of seek a respite from the Pentagon and all the trials and tribulations of the political structure. And also to contribute to your, I believe this is Perspective 7, have I got that correct? Perspective 7 conference. I know that you have discussed a lot of interesting things. I've seen your list of speakers, most impressive. I thought I might today naturally talk about security. I think it's too important to leave to the professionals alone. It's going to be on the front burner of the political agenda of this country for quite some time, and particularly the appropriations that we invest in our defense matters. Consequently, I put a high premium on communication and trying to educate people as to our needs, our views, our problems, and at the same time to become more sensitive as to how the civilian community looks at our work. Now, your business involves a lot of calculation about the future. I suspect some of you didn't do it too well this week. I thought you might be interested in just a few minutes I have at how I look at the emerging global strategic environment. I should stress, of course, that this is a large subject. Due to the press of time, my views will necessarily be compressed and sort of simplistic, but I will be happy to expand on them in the questioning period and also to address any queries you might have about the events of today in the Persian Gulf, which I'm sure by now you have heard something about. Any survey of security futures has to begin with a central proposition, and that is one that cuts across and dominates the strategic landscape, and I'm talking in general about Soviet military power. I won't dwell on the statistics here. I suspect that many of you are familiar with them. The fact is that the Soviet military buildup over the last 15 years has exceeded anything in world history. Harold Brown used to say that when we build, they build. When we stop building, they build. And certainly since this administration has been in office, we've discovered that when we restart building, that they still continue to build. The Soviet apparatus, the momentum which it has achieved building-wise, will continue well into the 1990s, even if they don't devote another new cent to it. It's most impressive, and it is something that we must deal with and we must factor into all of our calculations. How do planners look at the dynamics of this burgeoning phenomenon? First place, I think it's important to note the broad sweep of Soviet power. It presents sort of a new kind of challenge to us. People of my generation naturally fall back on World War II, but certainly the Axis powers were not of this character at all. While Germany had tremendous influence and power which could dominate Western Europe, and Japan similarly in the Western Pacific, neither one of them were a global power in the true sense. But today, the Soviet apparatus is capable of exerting power not only on all its own borders, but throughout the world. The Kremlin possesses a spectrum of power that's just unbelievable. In the nuclear area, we no longer are certainly not superior. Many people might argue that we have parity, but there is a very respectable case that can be made that we have lost even parity. Their conventional ground, sea, and air forces are able of operating not only sequentially but simultaneously on all of their European borders. Their naval forces operate every day in all of the major oceans. They have surrogates in the vicinity of every major key waterway and oil artery, and a highly developed terrorist mechanism in the Soviet Union. Perhaps from the military planner's point of view, most impressive is the Kremlin's close coordination and dovetailing of their military matters and forces with their economic and political structure. And you see this graphically displayed in a number of ways. From a naval perspective, I think it is most startlingly demonstrated in the close cooperation, coordination, and control of their merchant marine as well as their naval forces, and the two are integrated. At times it's very difficult to distinguish. And they do the same thing in terms of civilian and military air power. Simply put, it's a reality, a military reality that we cannot ignore. And make no mistake about it, the Soviets will use their power brutally and directly when they feel that the calculus is in their favor. Witness Afghanistan. It's not unusual, of course, for countries on occasion to use force against their enemies, but in the Soviet Union it's not unusual for them to use it against their friends. Witness, as members of the Warsaw Pact can testify. It's clear to me that they will continue to rely on raw power as a backup for all their policies and efforts to extend their influence, and in turn continues to improve their forces vigorously over the coming years. The bottom line, or the main point here from our standpoint, is that the military equation is not controlled by the United States unilaterally. What we invest, what we build, what emphasis we put on it simply does not control the balance. It must be related to what our major competitor also does, and I'm talking about the Soviet Union. In other words, to calculate the balance, we must constantly take into account their strength, their plans, their emphasis. If in no other sense, they are a superpower, certainly in the military sense. This gives them a proclivity to use their strength to foster instability, to exploit surrogates, to promote terrorism, to support small regional conflicts, and especially anti-Western regimes to challenge Washington in a variety of ways and in a variety of places. There is, of course, one possible bright spot, and I'm talking about Mr. Gorbachev's glasnost. We can't overlook it. We must take it very seriously, and hopefully we will see moderation. But it is certainly not clear at this juncture, not to me as a military planner or as to a participant in foreign affairs, that we have as yet seen basic changes in their foreign or military outlook. The changes that we have seen, and the encouraging ones at this point, seem mostly directed to social matters and economic structure. We hope that the moderation that we have witnessed will broaden and deepen, but I think it's just too early to predict that it will. What will not change is the party's control over the nation's war-making potential in every aspect of the economy. Most important, this ability facilitates the Soviet mobilization and any transition to a wartime footing that they have to make. They have an absolute fascination with numbers, which impacts heavily on our own planners. Lenin said that quantity has a quality of its own, and this certainly characterizes the Soviet military practice. They always err on the side of too many and too much. Moreover, there is no sign that they cannot sustain such a policy indefinitely from an economic standpoint. Now, what does this mean to American military planners? If we at some point have to engage the Soviets, God forbid that we have to, it's a fact of life that we will be outnumbered. With guns, weapons, men, and military leaders of my generation have come to accept that. It's difficult, but nevertheless they have over the years come to accept that. It forces us to look for ways to offset potential numerical superiorities with better concepts, better doctrines, technologies, better supply, advanced leadership, improved training, and above all, better personnel. We're locked into this practice. It's absolutely imperative that the U.S. military adopt that as doctrine. There is no other way until the Soviets change their philosophy and their investment strategy, and I see no prospect for doing that. No matter what you might think about the beauty of simplicity, and there's been a great deal written in the media that we should have more simple weapon systems and that we could go to more reliable and simple tactics, etc., etc. The fact is that when you are trying to counter numerical superiorities, when you are forced to build weapon systems that must exact a higher attrition rate than the enemy, you are to a certain extent locked into high technology solutions. Of course we strive for simplicity. Of course we strive for weapon systems that do not require maintenance, that are reliable, dependable, but the fact remains that given the numbers problem which we are confronted with, we must seek constantly, and will continue to do so, perhaps even more so in the future, high-tech solutions to some of these problems. Unfortunately, that is not necessarily cheap, but I see it as a fact of life for our future strategical thinking. The Kremlin, of course, has vulnerabilities, and we must not overlook these, and we must attempt to take advantage of every one of them. They have long borders that are difficult to defend, vast airspaces which are a continuing challenge for them. They are hampered by a number of natural choke points at sea, an inefficient industrial plant, questionable steadfastness of their allies. All of these considerations must go into our own planning. But the fact remains that it does not change the basic reality of their underlying power. Their strength is, simply put, awesome. Their telephones may not work, but their strength is still awesome. Moreover, the threat of Soviet power will loom over Europe for some time, and I do not see a diminution in that physical fact. Most important, this signal, or rather this specter, will reinforce our traditional need for allies for the foreseeable future. Frankly, the free world has little choice but to combine its efforts. And I'm talking about things like NATO, the mutual security pacts that we enjoy with Japan and Korea, and also more of our Asian allies as well as ANZUS. We must continue to stress and to emphasize and work to improve these. At the same time, it is imperative that we recognize that the character of our own coalitions is necessarily changing, is undergoing fundamental change. And frankly, we have been awfully slow coming to that conclusion. First of all, the success of our alliances has created new challenges, and I'm talking about things like the NATO deterrent has forced Moscow to look elsewhere than Western Europe for its gains and to look to new forms of warfare other than just major hostilities. As a consequence, we will see more emphasis on what we call low-intensity conflicts, small wars on the periphery of our traditional areas of interest. This means also that major alliances such as NATO must do likewise. They must look outward. They must share these challenges outside of the traditional area of interest. And in NATO's case, that has been primarily Western Europe. But the alliance, the NATO alliance, has been extremely slow coming to that conclusion. Our post-World War II arrangements simply don't handle these new types of warfare, these new interests well. It's something that we must deal with, and that our allies likewise must acknowledge, change their way of life, and deal with. We are seeing that today in the Persian Gulf. We are seeing it in Central America. We're seeing this challenge. We're seeing it in Central America. We are seeing it in Africa, where NATO has very deep and broad interests there, but has been extremely slow to acknowledge those interests or to work in a coordinated fashion, thereby dividing the labor and saving our resources and dealing with problems effectively. I predict that we will spend a great deal of our time and energy over the next few years in dealing with that problem and in trying to get our alliances involved. Second, post-war recovery and affluence has changed the balance of power within coalitions. And I'm talking about East and West. In short, it seems to have increased the Allies' voice within those councils and in turn diminished the U.S. role. Clearly today, our allies need and expect more give and take. They need more consultation. They expect to be consulted in the case of major decisions. In certain aspects, both parties have had trouble accommodating to this reality, and perhaps I can demonstrate it just for a moment. In Europe, we see a great deal of agitation for the United States not to take major moves without notifying, without seeking their advice, etc., etc. On the other hand, if the United States talks about restructuring its forces, making a fundamental change in its commitment, talks about outside involvement, they all hark back immediately to the original rationale of NATO, contend that it has not changed, and that this is time for superpower leadership. This is a time for superpowers to act decisively, not alliances. In other words, on one hand, they see a need for change. On the other hand, if it's going to cost them resources, if it's going to cost them money or effort, they see a reason not to change. That the United States must assume its traditional role of the burdens outside of the alliance. In my view, both parties must accommodate, and that will be the challenge of the next 2 decades. It will require a great deal of statesmanship. It will require patience. It will require imagination. We see this, I might just mention one of the ways this problem impacts on us domestically, and particularly with reference to the Persian Gulf today. You have seen, I'm sure, in the last few weeks, some of the debate in the Navy about the lack of minesweepers. Traditionally, as we have gone to the Congress to seek appropriations for minesweepers, one of the arguments that we have heard is you must not just total up your capability and say that's not enough and seek augmentation. You must likewise count allied capability and then come to the U.S. Congress and show us exactly what power the entire alliance represents, and we will then fill in the holes and discrepancies, etc., etc. That's great when allied minesweeping capability is available to you when you need it. But in an instance such as we are facing in the Persian Gulf today, allies make their own decisions and independent decisions whether to commit those things. Some of our allies have invested heavily in minesweepers, and the U.S. Congress has counted on that being available to the United States. And yet in the event of the actual crisis, it is not available. Third, nuclear weapons are becoming a serious challenge to our Allied unity. We're seeing that more and more as we're approaching the end game in some of our arms reductions efforts. And of course, we've seen it graphically demonstrated in New Zealand's more or less withdrawal from ANZUS in the last few years, or few months, because of its disagreement with U.S. nuclear policy. I suspect we will see that as a continuing trend and a very difficult problem for the free world's nuclear leader to deal with. No matter what course our coalitions take, certain military realities cannot be wished away or reshaped, and I think it's important that we understand that. For example, as the superpower and the leader of the free world, we are still expected to assume the leading role, and maybe the only role militarily, in things like nuclear weapons, the deep water protection of our maritime interests, particularly our lines of communications between allies and friends, and mobility for military forces in obscure places in the world. These three functions are ones that we do well, that we are structured to do well, and that none of our allies can do on a global basis. So part of our contract is that the United States will handle those functions. You could say the same about the bulk of free world air power, although it is not as graphic as the instances I mentioned. In essence, I'm talking about a fair division of labor. This in turn will require, of course, contributions from our allies in certain areas, and I'm talking about mainly in terms of manpower, reserve forces, and ground forces. They don't necessarily look at it that way. There are a number of specialized functions that they can contribute to the alliance that they have been reluctant to concentrate on. But as we go into the future, I suspect that it will have to change if our alliances are going to remain effective as a deterrent. Put simply, once such a contract is established, whether it's formal or informal, all the members and participants must honor it. And I'm talking about Europeans as well as Americans. Alliances are great for magnifying power, but we must realize that in turn they take away some of our independence, they take away some of our flexibility. And military planners see this in spades every day. It can be most frustrating, particularly to a military planner, to accommodate various political postures, various political interests, and at the same time to structure a military solution that is worthwhile and brings force to bear in an advantageous manner. I would say, looking to the future from an overall standpoint, that the overriding reality of security affairs is that we are engaged in a marathon, not a sprint. That may not be a comforting thought to you, but I believe genuinely it is true, and that it applies to the whole free world, and it would be folly to ignore it. We would ignore it at our peril. Until our alliances do modify and broaden, and particularly accept the burden-sharing principle, the United States will be required for the next few years to concentrate on increasing and improving its capability for influencing and engaging in small regional actions, many of which we're seeing now and one of which we're right on the fringes of in the Persian Gulf, in assisting small countries to defend themselves, and particularly to have a better capability in counterterrorism, which is plaguing us globally at this time. I'm talking, of course, about military limited objectives, things that require, scenarios that require partial mobilization, operations with a high political content. And again, I would cite the Persian Gulf as an example. These are especially difficult for military planners and operators. To find tactics and strategies that resolve all of these conflicting interests and still at the same time have some kind of satisfactory military outcome. Extremely difficult. Americans are not comfortable with these challenges. In general, I think they feel the stakes don't justify the effort which is required. But it's these kinds of sacrifice that keep our influence strong, that keep our world position strong, and in turn avoid large and truly costly wars. I realize that's a controversial statement, but I believe essentially it is true. I also believe that these kinds of challenges are going to be with us, like it or not, for quite some time. They certainly call for a new kind of warrior, not the kind that we have historically raised, and they drive us to what we refer to as the concept of jointness. That's a front burner item today in the U.S. military structure, and that is using the forces and the resources of all our military services in some coordinated manner to achieve our objectives. I think that's imperative not only from an effectiveness standpoint, but in an era of constrained resources, there is no other really viable answer. And we are putting great emphasis and stress on jointness. I may have given you the impression that there are nothing but insurmountable challenges looming ahead. I don't believe that's true. Paul Harvey said, in times like these, it's always helpful to remember that there have always been times like these. The problems I've described are part of my everyday business. They're daily fare for free world strategists. And frankly, if you can step back from the press of everyday affairs and look at it unemotionally, the long-range track record of our country in foreign policy and strategy is not as bad as it is often painted. We have achieved a great deal, and I think we should give ourselves credit for it. And I'm talking about the long period of uninterrupted peace in Western Europe. I'm talking about the tremendous advantage, or rather progress, which our allies in East Asia have made with American encouragement and help. I was the Commander-in-Chief Pacific for 2 years, and I met with many of the Asian leaders, and they constantly stressed that theme to me. We could not have achieved what we did in East Asia without the backdrop of American power, forward deployed power. Given the Washington travails I mentioned briefly at the beginning, I guess this makes me an incurable optimist. To work through these future challenges, and I am optimistic about them, will require determination, energy, statesmanship, but above all, a clear-eyed focus on reality. But it can be done. The free world has a great deal going for it, and so does the United States. I believe genuinely, and this is an arguable proposition, but I happen to believe it, that time is on our side in the competition, and that every year of peace is a victory for us and furthers our cause. And that's what my business is all about. That's keeping the peace, stringing out the peace, and allowing us that time to prevail. My major concern, and this is conditioned by my professional bias, is the inconsistency of our support for our security. We need a consistent and rational defense policy geared for the long run, instead of one that's marked by the peaks and valleys which have characterized so much of our history. And I can't stress that too much. That's my number one concern. The alternative is a pretty stark one. A world a great deal different and less hospitable than the one we are living in today. And that's certainly incentive enough to keep on trying. With that upbeat note, I conclude, Mr. Chairman, and I would thank you for the opportunity to be here, and I'd be happy to address any questions you might have.
We have time for a couple of questions. Please use the microphones for the questions and raise your hand.
Admiral, I appreciate very much the point you made about the distinction between the Axis powers and the fact that they were not global, and the Soviet Union, which is, because it means, among other things, that we certainly cannot afford the luxury this time of going into another depression as we went into in the 1930s. And yet we are being told here today that the main way to maintain our economic stability in this country is through severe cuts in the budget deficit. Now, Friday at the Pentagon, a report came out which indicated that if the Gramm-Rudman sequester goes into effect, the cuts in the defense budget for fiscal year 1988 will be as high as $35.8 billion below the President's request. Now, if protectionist legislation doesn't break up our global alliances, what would do it faster than these kinds of cuts in our own defense capabilities?
Well, I have very little to quarrel with you on. I think this will be a tremendous disaster. And of course, all military men realize that there are other things that we have to spend our money on besides military appropriations. We'd be the first to realize there are a lot of decent, humane demands on our society which must be met. And I think that the military man's major complaint is the one I mentioned at the end. We could deal with even less money than we're asking for now if we could deal with it in a consistent and reliable manner. In other words, in some approach where we knew what we would have next year, what we could plan for, what we knew we would have 2 to 3 years from now. I can't tell you how much money that would save. And when you hear people talk about we need 3%, we need 6% increases and so forth, they are really talking about under the current mode of operations of the U.S. government. You can always do, and this is what the Soviet buildup has done. They don't increase that much every year. They create just a fraction, but they do it every year over a long, long period of time. And you can build you can build an impressive apparatus that way, and one that gives you a lot of security at a lot less money. But our present way of appropriating funds, the way of deciding what we need, is frankly disjointed, inefficient, and very pluralistic, which usually ends up with no responsibility for any particular office, organization, or outfit, and with less defense for your dollar. Obviously, I don't have any blinding insights as to how to correct that, but that's a fact of life, and that's what we're agitating for, is some consistent approach that we can plan and count on. We take less money to get that.
I think we have time for one question.
Admiral Crowell, how do you assess the Iranian strength and resolve to strike back at the U.S. after today's attack on their oil rig?
I think that they will, of course, consider a range of possibilities. I think that their ability to do so is limited in very striking and very fundamental ways. I hear a great deal about their will and a great deal about their fervor, and we see some rather dramatic rhetoric coming out of Iran, but the ways to harm and to injure United States forces in the area are limited to certain ways because they simply don't have a wide capability, particularly where we are engaged, and that is at sea and in the air. I think terrorism is a very definite threat, and I have spoken from the very outset on this subject that one of the main things we must confront are the mining threat. The Iranians have a capability to mine, and they can hurt us in that way unless we're forehanded. Otherwise, there are very limited things they can do to us. They will be determined. They will not be easily deterred. And let me stress for you that our commitment there is not going to be risk-free or casualty-free. I predict some more trauma. I do not think that the risks will be unmanageable, and if the United States is determined to persist, that we can carry out our mission. But gains like this and policies like this are not implemented risk-free, and I would never pretend or contend they are. And the Iranians will be looking for ways to raise the risks.
Admiral Crowell, thank you very much. I know that we all appreciate your coming over here. And
now, who's going to tell me about the stock market? Does anybody in this room know anything about it?
You have 200 experts here.
Okay, thank you.
In just a moment, we'll return with more from the annual Investors Conference of the American Stock Exchange.